On October 1, 2025, at the AES summit in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré shocked the audience by declaring that Africa would limit cooperation with China. This statement immediately set the next stop in Beijing. How will China respond to this challenge? Let's take a hard look at their strategy globally. Infrastructure from Beijing. Does Africa want to continue depending on it, or will it rise up on its own? Look at the massive projects they have spread across the continent. The development stories painted with Chinese loans come with risks of debt and loss of autonomy. The question is, who is really controlling this game? This summit is not just about security, but also a global economic strategy battle. Traoré stepped up to the podium with a straightforward and challenging message. From all over West Africa, many countries are watching closely because they understand that today's choices will determine whether they walk the path of independence or continue relying on external powers. The strong voice of the youngest leader among them, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré, with calm determination and unwavering faith, presented 4 compelling reasons why Africa should not continue to depend on China. First, he exposed the reality behind the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which has funneled over $150 billion in loans to Africa from 2000 to 2020. He warned that these loans are not gifts but chains. Whenever debts go unpaid, Chinese companies tighten their grip just like they did at the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, a vivid warning for the entire continent. Second, Traoré warned that Africa's resources are being depleted. 70% of the world's cobalt comes from Congo, 60% of the copper mined in Zambia, and over half of Angola's oil exports flow straight to Beijing. Behind those figures is a loss of control over the continent's lifeblood. Third, he revealed the growing shadow of militarization. China established a military base in Djibouti in 2017, located at the gateway to the busiest shipping routes on Earth. Over 2,000 Chinese troops are stationed in peacekeeping missions across Africa. But Traoré warns, those uniforms bearing peace symbols can at any moment become instruments of power. And finally, the quiet but most dangerous reason is the dependence on digital technology. Huawei and ZTE have provided 4G and 5G networks for over 40 African countries. China's surveillance system has been sold to Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, raising fears of a new kind of digital colonialism, not through guns, but through cameras and cables. China's surveillance system has been sold to Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, raising fears of a new kind of digital colonialism, not with guns, but with cameras and cables. Traoré concluded that his words are not theory, but a warning. We have lived under French rule, bowed to the IMF, and surrendered to America. He declared, if we are not vigilant today, we will become China's new colony. Well, the speech at the summit was just the spark. The real fire erupted a few days later when President Ibrahim Traoré headed east to Beijing under the chandeliers of the Great Hall. He was welcomed in Beijing by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Premier Li Keqiang. This was an opportunity to soften the shock of his words in Ouagadougou while reminding him of friendship and cooperation. Chinese officials proudly pointed out the $200 billion infrastructure investment across Africa. They talked about roads, dams, hospitals, and power plants, along with unconditional loans and bright smiles. They emphasized, this is not a matter of interests. This is a matter of friendship. But Traoré did not back down. He did not trade trust for comfort. This moment would be replayed on African news channels for weeks. He looked straight across the Polish table and said, this is not friendship. This is a golden trap. Those words hit like a hammer. For a continent where many leaders have chosen to silently accept, Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was almost unimaginable. But at that moment, the young president stood taller than the giant sitting across from him. Beijing's response was swift. Within days, loans to Zambia and Ethiopia were postponed, new trade restrictions were applied to Ghana, and anticipated investments in Mali were abruptly canceled. That was economic pressure turned into punishment. However, the warning from China became a call for solidarity. In Mali and Niger, officials openly praised Traoré's defiance. In Burkina Faso, crowds flooded the streets wanting to show their solidarity. Even leaders who had kept their distance from AES began to quietly reconsider. For the first time in decades, the balance of fear began to shift, not against Africa, but against foreign forces seeking to control Africa. The economic crisis was expected to isolate Burkina Faso and shatter the Sahel alliance. On the contrary, it created a backlash. The ministers from Mali and Niger convened an emergency meeting and declared their full support for President Ibrahim Traoré. In Ouagadougou, members of parliament passed a resolution praising his stance and called it a second declaration of independence. And beyond Africa, the wave quickly spread. In Washington, former President Donald Trump, still a significant voice in U.S. politics, echoed a phrase he had used years ago: "China is sucking African blood." Though blunt, his words reflected a broader sentiment spreading across the U.S. that Beijing's influence had gone too far and too deep. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron seized the opportunity to remind the European Union that China's expansion poses dangerous consequences for both Africa and the West. His speech in Dar in 2023, once warmly welcomed, is now seen as prophetic. Suddenly, Traoré's challenge is no longer a solitary voice. He has allies in the highest circles across the Atlantic world. For ordinary African people, the symbolic meaning is even greater. The image of the young president of Burkina Faso rejecting Beijing's promises is spreading on social media across the continent. What was considered punishment has turned into affirmation. What was seen as a threat has become a source of inspiration. By standing firm, Traoré is not just another president. He is becoming a symbol. But just being a symbol cannot sustain a nation. The real challenge is whether this challenge can translate into tangible outcomes, economic independence, technological innovation, and a united African front strong enough to withstand external pressures. That test is about to begin. The challenge in the hall is one thing. Turning that challenge into lasting change is another. However, in the weeks following Ibrahim Traoré's speech, Africa began to show the first signs of deeper transformation in Nigeria, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. An alliance of leaders and entrepreneurs announced the launch of a domestic telecommunications initiative. For years, Huawei and ZTE have dominated networks in Africa, providing mobile connectivity platforms at low cost. Which local company can compete? But the alliance broke this pattern by collaborating with a foreign startup called Main One. Under the direction of Marcus Johnson, a Nigerian-American engineer who previously worked at Google, the project promises to deliver something noteworthy: a network that is 25% cheaper, maintained locally, and without the surveillance concerns of Chinese systems. This symbol holds tremendous power. For decades, it has been said that Africa needs outsiders to build the future. Now it is Africans themselves who are laying fiber optics, erecting towers, and writing software. This is not just an economic project. It is a cultural statement. We can build our own tomorrow. The ripple effects are rapid. University programs in Accra and Ouagadougou have introduced new courses on network engineering. New graduates, instead of heading to Europe or the United States, now see opportunities to apply their skills at home. Contracts that once went to Beijing's major corporations have been redirected to African hands. In just a few months, China lost its first major telecommunications contract on the continent worth over $3 billion. What started as a bold political statement in Ouagadougou has become tangible, easily seen in news reports, classrooms, and contracts. But even greater consequences are unfolding, reshaping the politics of the region. The political landscape of West Africa is beginning to change. For many years, numerous governments in the region have had to walk a tightrope, balancing Western aid, Chinese investment, and domestic pressure. But after Ibrahim Traoré's challenge, that balance is starting to be disrupted. In Burkina Faso, lawmakers have mentioned the name Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader of the 1980s, who once declared, "We will not pay the debt." For many, Traoré's stance is not just mere policy. It is history. Rebirth. People gathered in the town square, holding pictures of both leaders side by side and chanting slogans demanding a second liberation. Across the Sahel, similar movements are also gaining momentum. In Mali and Niger, civil organizations have called for audits of China-backed projects and demanded transparency. Radio hosts in Ghana debate whether their country should strengthen ties with the AES bloc. At universities, students are passionately debating whether Africa can achieve a development model that serves its people first. This symbol has spread beyond Africa's borders within the African diaspora community in the United States, especially in communities in Atlanta, New York, and Houston. Traoré's name has become a rallying point. Churches, citizen groups, and alumni associations have organized forums on Africa's economic independence for the first time in decades. Many African Americans feel that a leader back home is not only managing the crisis, but also shaping the destiny. This newfound pride is also having a ripple effect on politics. Leaders who once hesitated to confront Beijing's dominance have begun to find courage in Traoré's example. Ghanaian ministers hinted at revisiting oversight contracts. Nigerian officials discussed renegotiating loan terms. Even in Ethiopia, where Chinese funding is most abundant, discussions about alternative partnerships are becoming increasingly loud. However, the most profound change is not in contracts or policies. It lies in the mindset of ordinary people. At market stalls and in classrooms, in mosques and churches, everyone is talking about taking control of their future. Young Africans who once believed their talent belonged abroad are starting to see a different possibility. For their skills, energy, and creativity can be invested back home. For the first time in a generation, the question is not whether Africa can escape this situation, but how long it will take. In Washington, the response to President Ibrahim Traoré's challenge is a mix of surprise and recognition after many decades. U.S. policymakers largely believe that Africa's strategic choices will still depend on Western aid or the endless investment drive from China. However, a young leader from Burkina Faso has publicly rejected both models and called for an Africa-centered approach for U.S. lawmakers. This message is unmistakable. Congressional hearings are soon to provide testimony about Africa's second liberation, with analysts warning that if the U.S. does not engage, it risks losing not only influence, but also moral credibility. Commentators on cable news point out that Traoré's stance is evidence that Africa is no longer a passive stage for great power competition. It is becoming a true actor. Former President Donald Trump's words describing China as draining Africa's resources are being echoed with greater intensity, while some claim it is exaggerated rhetoric. Others believe they have tapped into the raw frustration of the African people, who are now openly voicing their opinions on the international stage. French President Emmanuel Macron seems to have been vindicated, reminding Europe that China's shadow over Africa has never been harmless. However, what truly astonishes many in Washington is the migration effect. In cities like Atlanta and New York, African American leaders are beginning to organize protests in support of Traoré. Editorials in major newspapers question whether the U.S. is overlooking its most obvious partner. In Africa's rise, is it its own citizens of African descent or not? With over 50 million African Americans and purchasing power exceeding $1.6 trillion, the potential to build a new bridge between the two continents suddenly becomes undeniable. For the first time, strategists are beginning to envision a partnership not defined by aid or exploitation, but by mutual respect and a shared destiny. However, that prospect remains fragile. Can Africa truly chart a path that avoids dependence on China and Western paternalism? That question is soon to shape the debate in many capitals beyond Ouagadougou. On the other side of the Atlantic, European capitals are watching closely. In Berlin and Brussels, diplomats are debating whether Trier's challenge to Beijing serves Europe's interests. For many years, the European Union has tried to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative with its own Global Gateway program, but it has had little success in Africa. Now, Ibrahim Traoré's words have brought them an unexpected ally, a leader right in Africa demanding accountability, transparency, and independence. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron sees Traoré's defiance as a warning to the West. He stated in a closed session that if we let Africa fall to Beijing, we will not only lose influence, but also our shared future. His statement reflects a harsh reality. Africa is no longer a peripheral issue, as its population is expected to exceed 2 billion this century. This continent is becoming the center of global trade, energy, and security. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Kremlin watches with curiosity and concern. Russia has penetrated Africa through military contractors and energy deals. However, Traoré's rejection of dependency also has an impact. The United Nations. African delegates are beginning to echo Traoré's words. Representatives from Ghana and Senegal have spoken of a new dawn, where Africa's resources will serve its own children first. Journalists call this movement Africa's second liberation, a phrase that resonates deeply within the African diaspora community. In the United States, analysts are working to determine the policy direction moving forward. Some suggest that Washington should publicly support Traoré, investing in Africa-led projects to strengthen independence from Beijing. Others warn against making him a symbol too quickly for fear of backlash or instability. However, despite all the debate, there is an undeniable truth. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country often overlooked on the world stage, is now shaping the geopolitical future of Africa. The global reaction shows much more than admiration for a single leader. It signals a change in perception. Africa is no longer a competitive subject. It is a historical narrative forming its own story. And at the heart of that story is Ibrahim Traoré, a name the world can no longer ignore. The surprising truth in this story does not come from Beijing, Washington, or Paris. It stems from the Africans themselves. From the momentum of Ibrahim Traoré has emerged a vision that few outside this continent could have predicted. The African Diaspora Development Network, or ADDN. At first it sounds like just a regular initiative, but its design is revolutionary. 23 African countries have signed on, committing to build a decentralized economic and political framework focused not on external lenders but on the African community abroad. And the migrant community is not a small force. Just in the United States, it represents 50 million people of African descent with a purchasing power of over 1.66 trillion. ADDN is not just a statement. It is a strategy. By linking the continent's natural resources with the capital and expertise of migrants, this project aims to create a closed development loop, with minerals driving industry, industry funding education, education reinforcing governance, and governance protecting sovereignty. For China, this is a surprising blow. In many For decades, Beijing has calculated that Africa's dependence will deepen. However, suddenly, Africa has tapped into energy sources that Beijing cannot control, the pride and wealth of its descendants abroad. Like a door that has been tightly shut suddenly opening, revealing a new path, and Ibrahim Traoré stands behind that door. No longer just a lone voice, but a symbol of a movement spreading from Ouagadougou to Atlanta, from Lagos to New York. The principles of ADDN are very simple, but they have shaken the foundations of global power politics. The charter of this organization states that Africa's resources will serve Africa first. There will be no copper mines, oil fields, or cobalt shipments exploited, without clear benefits for the people of this continent. For the first time, abundant resources are not seen as bargaining chips to attract foreign investment, but as the basis for Africa's self-determination. Infrastructure plans are being rapidly implemented. The Trans-Sahel Railway, designed by African engineers, solar power grids are being built with funding from abroad, and regional educational centers specializing in training the next generation of scientists and policymakers. Each project is modest in scale compared to Beijing's mega projects, but symbolically they are immense. They are owned, led, and funded by Africans. International observers began to call this the second liberation, not through revolution, but through construction. For the West, ADDN offers opportunities for support without domination. For China, it symbolizes the loss of monopoly. For Africa, this is a declaration of maturity. The continent no longer wants to be anyone's pawn. Leading all of this is Ibrahim Traoré. In speeches broadcast across Africa and beyond, he reminds audiences that this is not about him, but about a rising generation. But whether he acknowledges it or not, his face has become a symbol of a new Africa, an Africa that dares to say no to dependence and yes to its destiny. The golden trap has been rejected. Instead, a golden path is being opened, not by outsiders, but by Africa itself. Ultimately, the story of Burkina Faso and its young leader, President Ibrahim Traoré, is not just about resistance. It involves rebirth, dignity, and destiny. What began as a single warning issued in Ouagadougou one September morning has grown into something far greater, a movement that transcends borders, crosses oceans, and spans generations. It is not merely news about Africa. It has become a testament to the immutable truth that freedom is not something to be taken for granted. It must be asserted, defended, and renewed by every generation that wishes to live in dignity. Traoré's challenge reminds his people and the watching world that true sovereignty is never granted by empires or global organizations. It is held by those brave enough to stand tall before the giants. Burkina Faso, often seen as a small, landlocked country, is now at the center of a greater awakening. And Ibrahim Traoré, with thunderous words, has placed his country at the heart of the historical stage. This message resonates far beyond Africa for Americans who once fought for independence against colonial rule and then marched for civil rights on their streets. The voice of Burkina Faso sounds incredibly familiar. It is a reminder that the struggles of nations are interconnected, that dignity is not something borrowed, sovereignty is not something rented, and justice is never outsourced. For Africans at home and abroad, this is a call for a new dawn, a promise that their sacrifices and hopes can converge in a future built in their own way. Traoré's words still resonate. We do not ask for permission to be free, we rise up and take it. These words are not just for Burkina Faso, but for every country daring to believe in their own power. They belong to the youth in Africa who dream of building technology for Africa, for farmers in Mali who wish to harvest their land without foreign imposition, and for millions of migrants who have long prayed for a continent that cannot be subdued. Ibrahim Traoré's courage is not just the story of one man. It is a chapter about the rebirth of a continent. If you believe, as we do, that the bravery of this young leader is a blessing for Africa, then share this story. Let the world know that the second liberation has begun. Subscribe to this channel if you have decided to rise up and pray for Burkina Faso. Pray for the people of Africa, for the land that is rising up, refusing to bow down, and finally writing its own destiny.